What's next? This is a question we're all having to ask and answer more frequently. I'm Jenny Blake, your host of the Pivot Podcast and author of Pivot, The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One. For show notes from this episode, visit pivotmethod.com/podcast. If change is the only constant, then let's get better at it. Here we go. Hello, friends. I am so thrilled to be here with my guest today, Leah Smart. Leah is one of those Insta friends, and no, not from Instagram, one of those people that from the moment we connected, it's that Elizabeth Gilbert, you, as she describes in Eat, Pray, Love. I love this woman. Leah currently works at LinkedIn, but of course, woman of many talents, has her own company as well in coaching and building online courses around modern spirituality, manifesting, and getting rid of limiting beliefs. She's a writer. At LinkedIn, she's an L&D partner and the co-founder and co-host of the In the Arena podcast, which has been going for, I think, a year and a half now, going strong in 2020 with all kinds of crazy topics that they've covered together. I did a binge recently, and I have to say, I just love Leah's perspective on life, work, business, spirituality, personal development. Really just incredible. And if you enjoy this conversation, I think you'll also appreciate Pivot Podcast 97 on conscious business, super conscious capitalism, and the meaning revolution with Fred Kaufman, who had changed my life, certainly when I first worked at Google, and he moved over to LinkedIn, even though he's no longer there. So with that, Leah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. So excited to be here. And thanks for that amazing introduction. I felt the same, Insta friend.
Totally. And in fact, when we connected before we hit record, we just already dove right into deep conversation. And then we kept saying, okay, maybe we should just pause, get this on the podcast. Leah, I forgot to mention, because I have an I Heart Dogs category for podcast episodes. You have a dog. You live in New York City. What kind of dog do you have?
Yeah, I have a sweet golden doodle. Her name's Piper, and she she was supposed to be 40 pounds and she's 77. So my breeder kind of messed that up, but that's okay.
Okay, we need Piper and Ryder to meet. This is long overdue.
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, we're both near the Hudson, so it would be a quick walk.
Yes. There's so much to cover. I don't even know where to start, but let's start with something that I know is an increasing passion of yours, and mine too, is thinking about what you describe as modern spirituality, and even to be more specific, organizational spirituality. I love that with the In the Arena podcast. First of all, I love this example of kind of, not only do you have side hustles outside of work, but you have a side hustle within your role within the company. And I think internal podcasts are going to be an enormous trend moving forward. What I really appreciate within the Arena is that you and your co-host Jackie just dig right in. You're totally transparent, vulnerable, open. You cover spiritual topics. And I can imagine was not the easiest thing to initiate within the scope of your day job, if you will. So what has that been like? And what's your passion around integrating spirituality with business?
Yeah, it's so funny, Jenny. We haven't even talked about this, but I'm also a conscious business facilitator. So I'm it was funny to hear you talk about your interview with Fred in episode 97. But let's see. So, you're right. We started the podcast about a year and a half ago officially, but started recording in December of 2018. And the reason this all came about was because my co-host Jackie and I met right at the beginning of our coaching journeys where we were becoming certified. And one of our passions that was aligned was having more authentic workplaces. So bringing your whole self to work. And we realized quickly that this was something that, was going to connect us probably for a long time. And we started having these conversations on our couches in our little New York City apartments. And one day we said, why don't we just start a podcast? And it just kind of came up. It was not a plan. I am certainly someone who I've, been on a spiritual journey myself and was feeling like, wasn't sure, it's kind of like that, am I ready? Is this the right time? Am I saying the right things? And had all of those sort of, fears bubble up, but knew that my purpose was really to support people's, personal and spiritual development. And so we ended up actually having someone that we knew within the company who had just become the head of mindfulness and compassion at LinkedIn. His name's Scott Shute, and he agreed to be our executive sponsor. And so we started this podcast. We were pretty safe at the beginning. Like, I think, especially compared to now, we were pretty safe. We definitely shared our journeys, but it was funny, Jenny, when we first started, I was scared to use, I'm calling it the S word, which is actually our upcoming episode. It's called the S word, spirituality, at work. And I struggled with it for a while. I synonymed the heck out of it, trying to figure out how I could make it so I didn't scare people or trigger them. And so, that's been actually my own journey, which has helped me with what I'm calling coming out spiritual. And I want to support other people doing that in companies in a way that feels non-divisive and really brings people together.
I love that. And it's funny that you've mentioned that, because I was also, when I was attending Union, which I did a semester and a half in the fall of 2018, and then the half of the next semester. And my concentration for the master's would have been interreligious engagement with a focus on spiritual not belonging, and specifically the intersection of faith and work, which longtime listeners of the podcast know I'm very passionate about. So you and I share this passion. And I took a class called Double Belonging that was about spiritual fluidity. And I can't tell you how many people that when I started any podcast episode that addressed spirituality directly, A, and then B, the ones that would actually just integrate somebody's faith background and how it motivates them or how they lean on it for courage. And I'll put some of those episodes in the show notes. People would write in droves to say, thank you so much. Or I work at XYZ big company and I've never told my coworkers about my faith background. And then on the flip side, you and I were talking about the kind of certain issues we see in efforts to build bridges and bring people together. So in this double belonging class, we use the term, not just spiritual fluidity, but coming out of the spiritual closet. And it sparked this intense discussion, and people were saying, you're appropriating queer theory. You can't use this term, like coming out of the spiritual closet. And I mean, that just takes us on a whole nother tangent, but
different conversation, right?
Yes. So we can put a pin in that, but it's just amazing. And I think spirituality and faith is something that so many of us lean on to get through tough times. And I love hearing your journey, because with the podcast, I mean, talk about diving into the deep end. It's not that many episodes in. And now in 2020, you've talked about letting go. You've talked about COVID, the transition to working from home, on race and allyship in America. I mean, those episodes were so powerful. Was it hard for you to address those topics? I mean, I'm sure there was part of you that felt like we can't not address them, but that's intense.
Yeah. So, so we had actually sketched out the outline for Letting Go right before George Floyd died. And we were ready to record Letting Go. We would record on Fridays. And we were ready to record. And that was the week that he died. And that all of this, came to a head. And, what ended up happening was, Jackie, who's my co-host, called me and said, I think we need to talk about this. And I was in tears. Like I was so emotional. I said to her, I was like, I don't know if I'm ready. I want to talk about it. And I don't know if I can get through like sentences right now, because I'm still processing so much of not just George Floyd, but the meaning of all of this. Like for me, I think each of us probably who's involved in this, in the journey that we now are all being put on, is coming to terms or like having to come to Jesus about how we've been, how we've played a role, the pain that we've buried and all of that. And so I was like, I don't know about this. And that first episode on race and allyship, we ended up recording that day anyway. I said, call me back in an hour. And she called me back in an hour and we recorded. And, as you probably heard, Jenny, we were both crying for a lot of the conversation, and it wasn't, typically we intend to have learnings come out of it. So this is the first time we ever recorded an episode where there weren't clear learnings. We just said, we need to have a conversation. And then part two really was, okay, this is something we've all been thrust into. How do we move forward and become, better ancestors, as Layla Saad talks about in her book, White Supremacy, Me and White Supremacy. So yes, it was hard.
Yes. I mean, and you released part one on June 4th. So pretty early. I think the protests have been going for about a week. And I thought it was really powerful, just the nuance of part one and part two. Part one being, as you said, processing, which, by the way, there's so much learning for people just in getting to witness processing. And I thought the two of you had a very interesting conversation because you're very good friends, you're coworkers, and then your experience as a Black woman, not only in America, just growing up, and also within the context of LinkedIn, and then Jackie's as a white woman and as your friend and trying to be a better ally. And I just loved the emphasis on allyship that you talked about. And then in part two, even Jackie sharing her learnings of here's what I could have done differently on part one, and I just kudos to both of you and for being willing to learn out loud on the podcast for your company that employs you. It's just, and knowing your coworkers are listening, I think it's very brave.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I it was funny. We talked after episode one, after we'd processed, and we both immediately had started reading White Fragility. Jackie's still reading Me and White Supremacy. And she's just gone on this, it is like quantum leap growth, right? We all are being forced into. And so when we came back together to plan the second part, we said, one, we want to make some things really clear. But two, she was like, I really have learned so much because I finished White Fragility between then and now. And so, we felt that the conversation was really raw in the first one, but there were things that, like you said, she learned that she said, I want to clean this up. Because again, you're right. I love that phrase, learning out loud. That's literally what we've been doing. And I actually love that our episodes have shifted kind of in that way this year. So even our episode we just recorded on spirituality, we had no outline, we had nothing. We just said, we're going to hit record and see what happens.
That is amazing. It's fun with a co-host because you can do that. Like I have been hosting a Pivoting Around a Pandemic series with who's now a good friend, Dr. Michael Consuelos. And it's helpful to have someone to bounce things off of. And then you have kind of a record of this insane year because it's so difficult to create top takeaways for any of these topics because they're just so vast. They're so new. They're so chaotic. They're changing all the time. And just because we start a podcast doesn't make any of us an expert at any of this. Although I will say you clearly have such a vast depth of knowledge and wisdom. I learned something from you actually when I learned many things, but I learned something in binging in the Arena episodes, which I forget where you cited it. So if you remember, let me know, that there's a proposed 6th stage of grief, which is meaning. After acceptance, and I know in grief, it's nonlinear, and even we often misinterpret the process as linear, but I love this idea of adding meaning into the grief process. And I would even say navigating change as we're all experiencing in 2020. Can you just share a little more about that?
Yeah. So it was a Harvard Business Review article that came out, and I was shocked and like so proud. It's such a strange, funny word to use. It wasn't me that added it, but so just so proud to see that because I have a few close friends who are going through some very real grief right now. And gosh, so much of the world, so much of the country is going through real grief. And, I don't know about you, if you've taken the Enneagram, Jenny, but I'm a 7, which means I don't like hard things. Typically, like scary feelings scare me. And in my coaching and going through my, you think you want to become a coach. And so you go through coaching training thinking I'm going to learn to be a coach. And you realize that you're the one that needs the coaching. So, in my year of going through coaching, I really learned to sit with hard things. And so I loved the stages of grief because I love having that framework and the understanding of where you, like you said, you slide back and forth. But, you will come out the other side if you continue to move through it and process. But I just loved seeing the meaning part because I hear a lot of people when we lose someone or lose something, we slide straight into it's not fair. And sometimes people drown there, right? Like life's not fair. It's not right. I've heard close friends say, why do good things happen? Bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. Why do great people die young? This is actually why spirituality has been so powerful for me this year. I've been contemplating and reading a lot about death and reincarnation. It's one of the most powerful experiences. And it's because I found meaning. And I realized I wasn't seeing the whole story. And so I love that the 6 stages has been added because now people say, instead of like, I've gotten through the grief and I've accepted or integrated, it's like, and what's the meaning now? And so I'm hoping for that for the people who are experiencing grief right now, that comes out. And at the same time, I was talking to your good friend, Mike Robbins. We had him on our podcast earlier this year. And he said the perfect piece, which was also don't spiritually bypass the grief, right? So I want both to be true, but I love that we end with, and what's the meaning?
I find spiritual bypassing such an interesting and tricky concept, because if you're at all interested in spiritual growth, it's true. We have this tendency to, and especially, even look at the fight for justice in America. And there's this, I've seen comments that are like, please don't just send your light and love right now. We need more than that, And in the spiritual community, sometimes there's this, this bad thing happened. Let me find the silver lining right now. Let me just jump to, but it's all good because, or I find myself, I'm a big fan of Byron Katie's work and doing turnarounds. Mm-hmm. And I would just be like, any stressful thought, turn it around, turn it around, turn it around. And I was doing all these spiritual gymnastics. Sometimes I call it the personal development police, where don't have a low vibration thought, or, don't be contagious with your emotions. And yet, so we don't want to spiritually bypass, but what you're saying is so important. And what I love Mike as well, that we've got to feel the grief and go through it and accept what's happening. I'm not a 7. I think I'm a 3, if not a 2 or a 1 or some kind of sandwich of those down in that range. But I think I'm married to a 7. But I love certain change that I choose, but I don't know. I think that's why I wrote Pivot. It's not easy to adapt to change. And as I say in Pivot, all change involves loss. And that comes from a beautiful book called The Examined Life, Stephen Mitchell. All change involves loss. And that is what we are experiencing in 2020, even if it's the loss of a normal day, the loss of eating at a restaurant, the loss of seeing family in person. There's so much, and the list goes on, and it continues growing. And this idea of the 6th stage of meaning means that we can still oscillate between all the other stages and then bouncing over to, and what is the meaning? And what am I learning? And as Kelly McGonigal would say, the post-traumatic growth that happens. So of course there's post-traumatic stress, but there's also can be post-traumatic growth. And even she is quick to say, but not always. And don't be hard on yourself if you're not there yet, or you never get there around certain traumas, which is absolutely the case too.
Yeah. I was, as you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, your life must be so fun married to a 7, because the 7's all about fun.
They are all about fun, spontaneity, change. The only constant is change. I married into this mindset. That's true. And then I love 7s. Like when I meet 7s, I'm like, oh, no wonder we get along. It's weird. It's like, I don't know if you're a P or a J on Myers-Briggs. Are you a P by any chance?
I'm a P.
I know it. See, I think there's a correlation because I work so well and I often have friends who are ENFPs or INFPs.
That's
And
what
they're
I
like,
am. I'm an
they're like, thank you
INFP.
for being my J. My friend Becky is like, thank you for being my J whenever we would work together at Google. And even still, it's really sweet.
I love it. Yeah, there's a nice balance too that gets created, right? Like, I was an ENFP. I tested as an ENFP in high school, and then I actually just took the 16 personalities test, that the kind of like updated version of the Myers-Briggs, and I was an INFP, which is interesting to like see that I've moved from extrovert to introvert, but makes perfect sense. I think those change, although I know, Enneagrams don't change. It's just that we transcend them.
Mm.
But you had said something about Byron Katie too, which, I literally yesterday was just working with a friend that I've been teaching some of the Kabbalistic principles. I've studied Kabbalah for 10 months, and I've been sharing some of them with him to support his growth. He's been really interested. And so we just kind of have these conversations. And I just did the turnaround with him yesterday. And this is so random, Jenny, but like I get so confused by step 5, which is the turnaround. In belief work. And I think it's already so powerful. So, if you're not familiar with Byron Katie's work, you take a belief and you ask yourself if you're sure it's true. And then you ask if you're 100% sure. And then it's how am I when I believe it's true? And then it's who would I be without that thought? But then I totally blank on what I'm supposed to be doing at the turnaround. So I would love your clarity.
Funny. Yeah. Well, I love how she says it's a meditation first and foremost, the whole process. So is it true? And we often go, yes, of course it's true. She hates me, Can you absolutely know that it's true? Well, no, we can't really absolutely know anything. So in a way, the answer is almost always no, you can't absolutely. How do you feel when you think that thought? And I love you just said it. Who would you be without that thought? So then in the turnarounds, I like to have fun with it. And there's a ninja trick that Byron Katie does too. People call her Katie for short, where you flip the sentence as many ways as you can. So I hate her. I hate myself. She hates herself. And then I like to find how any of those could be true. But then sometimes Katie will add my thinking about so-and-so. So she adds this phrase, my thinking about, and that means, and I can almost always find the way that, oh, it's my thinking about this situation that's creating the stress, not her, not me even. And so with the turnarounds, I just try to make as big a list as I can. And I always ask the person I'm coaching or myself, which one feels the most true? So once you have a list of 3, 5, 6, 7, which one feels the most true? And usually there's one that as soon as the sentence comes out, there's this pop, this bubble, this like, they're like, oh, it feels like oxygen. It's like, oh, that's freedom. That's the thought. And a lot of people miss this other part that it's kind of hidden. I like at the very end of the whole exercise, she has 2 next phrases. And I don't know if you use these often or not. You say, I am willing to ... And then I look forward to ... So let's talk about something like allyship or social justice. We could say, I am willing to get it wrong or to get called out. And you could even find a way to say, I look forward to getting it wrong, or I look forward to getting called out because it means that I'm taking a stand, or because it means that I'm trying. And that I have found creates so much freedom to say that I get to find some small way, even if it's not whole bodied yet, where I can look forward to this thing that I'm afraid of, or right now in my business in the pandemic, I am willing to lose almost all of my income, or I'm willing to lose all of my income. Why? Because I would learn something new. I'd get to know myself. I'd get to take a step back. And then I could say, I look forward to not getting booked for another thing for the rest of the year. What's that like? It's just can be very fruitful to play with these thoughts. And so yeah, that's my riff on the work, as it's called.
Okay. I'm obsessed with these last 2. You've made this so clear for me, and I love it. And it's, what you're making me think about is I'm studying tapping right now. I don't know. Are you familiar with tapping or EFT?
I am. I don't really do it often enough, but there was a while where I was doing it, and it always feels so good. I don't even do it with all the different mantras. I mean, there's so much. Tell me more. Tell us about your favorite tapping practices.
Yeah. So, okay. So here's what you were helping me think about, which is this idea that, um, like, so I love the idea of combining the work we need to do with our brains with the work we need to do with our souls. And so, people often think like, oh gosh, spirituality. Well, I'm not spiritual. Or, or I don't need help or support on from like a therapist or whatever it is. And Byron Katie was one of the first episodes. So I listened to probably all of Oprah's Super Soul conversations for the last 2 years. And that was a huge part of my spiritual journey. So, I started, I didn't plan to go on a spiritual journey. I don't think most people plan that. But I had moved back to New York and I was in a new role and I was experiencing really bad anxiety. And, I've shared this on my podcast, but I literally one day just was in my apartment, and I was so stressed and I just fell to my knees and I was like, I need help. And I got up to walk my dog and something in my gut said, go check Oprah's Super Soul. And I never listened to podcasts before this point. She was the only one I had bookmarked and I never listened. And so I was like, all right, I'll go check. And that day, she had released her episode with Marianne Williamson, which was A Return to Love. And it was a 20th anniversary and I'd never heard of Marianne Williamson. I listened to this episode and it transformed me. Like it was that 30, 40 minutes that I was like, oh my God, I get it. And if you're not familiar with her work, the simplest way to put it is she's studied a really amazing metaphysical book called A Course in Miracles. And probably one of the most core foundations to A Course in Miracles is that there are only two emotions in this world. It's either fear or love. And what stuck with me was I was able to support my own my own emotional needs through this spiritual path. And oftentimes we separate those so much. And so Byron Katie was also someone who was on Oprah. And in the same way, she combines the psychological side of this with spirituality and gives us permission to have both exist together. And so, the mention of tapping was actually that I'm listening to a book right now by Nick Ortner. It's called The Tapping Solution. And I started tapping because, Gabby Bernstein is one of my, I call them expanders, and I love her work. And so I dove into Judgment Detox, one of her books, and I wanted to learn more. So I went to go learn about the tapping solution. And one of the things Nick Ortner says in this book is part of the reason that we, especially in the West, are so separate so much mind and body and spirit is because, Rene Descartes, hundreds of years ago, wanted to start studying the body. And so he asked the Pope if he could go and study cadavers. And the Pope said to him, you can, but do not explore anything in the mind, only explore the body. And part of the reason he had to make that agreement was because the Pope and the church were afraid of losing power, because they thought that if we studied the mind, we may no longer believe in the faith that was being, shared. Not we, but, the people who are in the Catholic Church may no longer believe in the faith that was being shared with them. And so I just noticed this very real separation of people believing that our minds, bodies, and our souls are totally separate. And it feels like it's just, I don't know about you, Jenny, but it feels like it's just so common in the US. And then when you go somewhere like, somewhere else around the world, especially in the East, you just don't experience that in the same way.
And we also have so much of our identity tied up with work and output and productivity. And it goes back to the founding of this country. And even I remember writing an essay on this, I should dig it up, at Union on the American dream and how this notion of a meritocracy is so flawed. I'm not the first person to say that, but a lot of the American dream, a lot of the premise is pull yourself up by your bootstraps based on your own merits and your efforts. And that's well and good. But as we've seen this year / since time immemorial, there's so much systemic problems built in that we say with one hand, oh yeah, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And then with the other, we push people down and we don't have the social structures and social support. For example, and I usually don't get too political on this podcast, but it's hard not to these days. come on with this universal health care. It's like Obama worked so hard to get Obamacare passed. And why on earth can we not just give basic health care to all of our citizens? What the hell is wrong with us? Like, this is the year of COVID. I am personally paying for myself and my husband $1,500 a month for our health care, which is middle of the range. I didn't even pick the Cadillac. And by the way, I signed up right before COVID, literally the month prior.
Oh my gosh.
So in a way, I'm glad that I don't have the bottom of the barrel plan. And they just sent a letter saying we're raising your premiums to $1,700 next year. What? That is more than a roof over somebody's head. You know what I mean? This is fundamental. I don't know who can argue to say, oh yeah, we actually don't want certain people to have health insurance. What kind of country? You know? Yes, to have healthcare. Thank you. That's what I'm.
It's wild.
Yes.
No, it's totally wild. Like, we should all be entitled to basic care, right? Like,
yes.
I agree that, you know, maybe we don't become, you know, totally like socialist environment, but it's really just about like looking at human life and valuing it. To me, like, that's really the basics of this.
Yes. And giving people, I don't know how I got on this rant, but giving people what we don't want is that one hospital bill puts somebody in debt for the rest of their life or the rest of their career.
That's
or
right.
One disease, the prescription drugs are so expensive that it bankrupts the entire family because they can't pay for the basic healthcare that they need. So remind me, Leah, why did I get on this rant? What were we talking about? Where did this come from?
I was talking about Byron Katie and spirituality and
then
separating
tapping.
mind and body and spirit and tapping. There we go.
No, okay, mind, body, spirit. Then we got over, wow, what a rabbit hole. No, it was something you said about... And I was talking, our identity and work. There it is. And
yes.
Our proclivity, especially in the States, to focus on the mind. Yes. And to focus on output and identity as work. And I think that's why, you know, back to Mike Robbins and his book, Bring Our Whole Selves to Work, is important. And it's funny, when I was at Google, I started my blog, Life After College. And that's what eventually led to me being able to launch my own business, move to New York. And I would blog about a breakup. And then a coworker would come the next day and say, hey, I'm so sorry to hear about your breakup. And it was this really odd but empowering thing to be living so transparently that even my coworkers kind of knew what was going on. And this was back in 2007, 2008. And I wonder if you've experienced that with your podcast. Do you have coworkers that, I don't know, come up and talk to you or ping you or I mean, now it's virtual, but email you and say, like, I don't know, giving feedback or just talking about what you shared?
Yeah. I mean, yes, we do. I mean, Jackie and I both have people that come to us and say, like, you know, I can't believe how vulnerable you are. Thank you so much. Or, you know, we talk about, you know, our own journeys. You know, Jackie shares she's been through a divorce and, you know, really just kind of finding herself and so have I, and my own, you know, experience with anxiety and all of this. And so we definitely hear from people who are like, I relate to this and I didn't realize anyone else is going through it. And that's kind of part of the whole thing, right, Jenny? It's like we don't do this work to, from a place of ego. We do it to give permission for other people to be just as open as we are. And like, I know for a long time, I would not have, felt comfortable sharing these things. And at the same time, it's like, how do you show up in the truth of what's going on for you now? Because all of this continues to be a path and a real journey, and not come from it from a place of, well, I'm looking back and now I'm perfect. Right. So there is like there's making sure, and we talk about this all the time in every podcast planning episode, we talk about how important it is for us to be real about where we're at now and showing our imperfections, because, you know, that's what helps people connect. But it's like, it's funny because it's, you know, like I know you're familiar with Brené Brown and know her work. It's, you know, she says we look at vulnerability as weakness in ourselves, but courage in others. And that's kind of the work of being more vulnerable. But then the gift we get is connection.
One thing you said on the race and allyship episodes, you said we don't all want to be educators. And I wanted to ask you about that because I actually felt a sense of relief when you shared that. And it can be tricky to navigate learning out loud, being vulnerable. And then, of course, anyone with any size platform at all, part of this year's movements are silence is violence. We even see big companies speaking up and taking a stand. And now the Facebook ads boycott. And there's a lot going on where this notion of silence is violence. And I think that's very important for us to consider. And I find myself self-conscious, as you said, it's, having such a beginner's mind, it can be tricky to speak up in some way, but then give ourselves permission not to all become educators in any one space.
Right.
And then I talked with Mike about this. I'm curious, this is part 2 of my question, take it wherever you want, on psychological safety, because I think it's increasingly concerning what's happening with cancel culture, where people who I've seen aren't even making the egregious mistakes. Like their heart is in the right place. I know intention doesn't equal impact, but seeing the takedowns and the way it gets so out of hand on social media, I think it's really hard for people to step out and be vulnerable and be imperfect. We say it. We say, oh, you got to do something, even if it's imperfect. But then watching other people kind of get canceled or taken down or even canceled for writing a letter about cancel culture is just, I don't know what to do with that. And I'm wondering if you've wrapped your head around any of this.
Yeah, I mean, the first part of your question or what you shared is the idea of us not all always being educators or being perfect in our field. And I think I'm sure you feel similarly, when you're working as a coach or, you're saying that you're becoming this subject matter expert. It's scary at first to admit, at least for me, to admit imperfections, right? Because if you are supposed to be supporting people, how are you imperfect? That was a story I used to tell myself. Like, if I want to be a spiritual teacher and support people in, modern spirituality, well, I then better be perfect. I better make sure I'm, I have no chinks in my armor, so nobody can call me out. And yet you realize, like I realized as I kept, looking at people who are expansive to me, most of their books and most of their stories, they talk about their mistakes and the ones that happened recently. And so it's really like, I'm not an educator. I am someone who is committed to a practice. And so like practice, I shared this in a recent episode, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes the student, right? And so I'm just moving towards this, like, okay, I'm a student, and I want to share what I know, and I want to make it accessible. So, living in both of those is really valuable. But the cancel culture piece, I struggle with this a bit. And I was just talking to someone about this yesterday with the Amy Cooper incident and how she was, fired from her job. And we were talking about how she's basically been made out to be a pariah. It's like she's probably not hireable right now. Like there are all sorts of things that have happened to her because of this one incident. Now, what she did was absolutely wrong. We all saw it. We saw her use her white privilege. We saw her. She did the textbook thing. And I think she actually was in some ways more powerful than George Floyd's murder and Derek Chauvin, because most people would looked at that and were horrified, could not believe it. They would never do that, right? But when they saw Amy Cooper, it was like, oh, shoot, that could have been me. And I think that's where she has become a really powerful influencer on a lot of, white America who may claim that they're progressive or claim that they're colorblind or that they're not racist instead of anti-racist. And at the same time, I look at her and I go, wow, like she just lost everything because of a 30-second video. And I have a hard time with the work that I do, being okay with shaming people. So I don't know the answer, but I certainly feel like if everyone's just afraid to be shamed and they know they're going to just be they could be fired. I mean, forget wrist slapping. They could be fired. They could be excommunicated. I mean, they could be blasted on social media and humiliated for the rest of their lives. We're not going to make progress because then no one's going to want to say anything.
Right. And what I found in the context and cultures I've been in that have a very actually zero tolerance policy around mistake making, my impulse was to stop trying when I was in those cultures. And of course, I'm going to overcome that impulse. I'm going to just observe that in myself. But there were many moments, even at Union, where I was just like, I don't want to speak. I've never felt like that. I've never felt like I literally do not want to contribute in class because it's so tense and it made me, I could relate to those who get so turned off by trying and then getting shamed that they don't want to try at all. And of course, again, like I don't want to be that way, but I saw how easy it would be to say, well, F it then. I can't please you anyway. I can't, whatever. And the interesting thing, I actually read an article about Amy Cooper that said she had a history of essentially toxic interactions and trying to get the superintendent or the doorman of her building fired, and a lot of history around it that kind of made me feel not better. I still don't want anybody to be publicly shamed and have your name just, completely dragged through the mud. But we've learned a lot. And I love what you said about how, that had people wake up of not just, are you not racist, but what do you do when you're triggered? What's your go-to? What assumptions are you making, even in a tricky interaction? And New York City is so dense that there's a lot of civility and a lot of cooperation. And then there's a lot of conflict sometimes because you're just thrown into this melting pot with everyone. So it can be, especially during times like COVID. But reading about her history kind of indicated to me that she does have a pattern of very toxic relationships. And of course, I don't know her personally, but it wasn't like, oh, Amy Cooper is some angel that's only ever done good in the community. And now she's been publicly shamed, which is the name of a book, by the way, that I reread during 2020. And I think that speaks
to... That makes me feel better.
Yeah, it made me feel better too, because if we take it to a spiritual perspective, there is karma in action, and karma, each action has an equal and opposite reaction. And I think it's so important. And part of what we're seeing with Me Too movement, what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing with broader social justice, fights for social justice, is that the old way isn't going to work anymore. And people are being called to task for actions. I'm even seeing this among musicians that I once loved, where they're being called out for sexual misconduct and basically rock star behavior that might have been fine in 1980, but it's not okay now. And so I think there is good that comes out of saying, listen, you can't just be a dick anymore. Pardon my French.
Doesn't work.
No, that's not going to work. We're in 2020. We got to do better. And what you said, and I wholeheartedly agree, shaming people doesn't work. It's not, it might, I don't know how much, I wonder how much learning and reckoning Amy Cooper is actually doing. But I will say that I'm with you on, I want to build bridges and help people. Like if someone is very close to being an ally, but they're an imperfect ally, how, and myself included, oh my goodness, top of the list, like how do we bring people in rather than pushing them out because of imperfection?
Yeah. And I was, we talk about allyship a lot at LinkedIn. And one of the ways that we talk about it is that allyship is a verb. So in the similar way that I was just sharing, you are, like, for example, you are an author and you are a career strategist and you're an expert in your field, but you're also a practitioner who is learning, right? So you are probably in a constant phase of learning more, taking in more information so you stay relevant and get to create, spaces where you can pivot based on what's needed in society and in the world. I'm the same way. I'm constantly reading up on development, personal development and spiritual, and trying things out and practicing. Why is it that allyship has to be you're either in or you're out? You're either perfect or you're not. And we have this whole all right, we fire this person, now we're clean, like we can wash our hands and say everyone's clean here and pure. But allyship really is a verb.
Beautifully said, Leah. This has been such a delight. I could talk to you for hours, and I feel that we very well need to do a follow-up because we've only just scratched the surface. Thank you so much. And can you let people, listeners, know where they can find you if they want to keep in touch?
Sure. Yeah. So you can find me either at my website, leahsmart.co, or on Instagram, it's Leah_smart. Those are the places to find me. And of course, LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn at just Leah Adrienne Smart. And thank you for having me, Jenny. This was awesome.
Oh, of course. It's been my honor and joy. And check out the In the Arena podcast. And Leah also hosts some really fun public conversations through LinkedIn. So I'll just leave it there. Leah, you're amazing. Please keep doing this beautiful work that you're doing in the world. I can't wait to see where you go from here. And I hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you. You too. I can't wait. Instafriend.
Yes. Hashtag Instafriend. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Pivot Podcast. Make sure you don't miss an episode or my insider tips and templates by signing up for Pivot List, a curated twice monthly newsletter where I share the inside scoop on what I'm reading, watching, listening to, and the latest tools I'm geeking out on. Sign up at pivotmethod.com/pivotlist. Get show notes from this episode at pivotmethod.com/podcast and connect with me on Twitter at Jenny_Blake. Remember, build first, then your courage will follow. Hasn't it always?